Dragon Age Origins, developed by BioWare, published by Electronic Arts, and released in 2009 for the Sony PlayStation 3, Microsoft's Windows and Xbox 360, Apple's macOS and classic macOS is, as the name suggests, the first in the Dragon Age series of games and my first completed BioWare RPG and Western RPG. In it, you play the role of a Grey Warden, tasked with uniting the disparate forces of Ferelden against the upcoming Darkspawn threat. Sound familiar? Your task will have you journey across Ferelden lands to meet the Dalish Elves, the Orzammar Dwarves, and the Human and Redcliffe Denerim armies, where you will meet countless allies, foes, beasts, the paranormal and supernatural alike, as you hack, slash, slam, and talk no jutsu your way to the end of the game. I'll be discussing my experiences with and analyzing the various mechanics of the game to determine how well they work to tell the story of the player character, reinforce the themes, and how the ancillary aspects work to sell the high fantasy, as they all pertain to my first playthrough and experience of the game. Let's start by saying that I think Dragon Age Origins is a good game. It took me 74 hours to beat, all of which was real gameplay as there is no grinding in this game. Quests are non-repeatable and enemies do not respawn, and while I believe grinding is possible, it is likely an insanely tedious and timely task. There are technically random battles in this game, a random chance for one to occur when traveling on the map screen from one named location to another. When this happens, the blood trail on the map, which indicates player movement, is paused and crossed swords appear on the spot at which the player was stopped. It should be noted that this does not always indicate a random battle, however, and is the game's symbol or indicator of an encounter. These are not always hostile, sometimes being a merchant or other helpful NPCs. Hostile encounters are the only way to grind XP, and it must be stated yet again that encounters do not always happen as one travels, so trying to grind this way would be extremely tedious and time consuming. I am glad that grinding is at the most basically non-existent, because the pacing of the game would slow to a crawl if it had been at all necessary or encouraged. As the player can approach the main story objectives in whatever order they please, having enemies' levels scale to meet the players was a great decision to make to keep up the flow of the gameplay loop. Having to grind doesn't add to the player's experience of being a Grey Warden, instead introducing an effective time gate to progression in a narrative where time is a limited resource. The game's dungeons, great in length with incredibly high enemy counts, serve as your grind areas and are well integrated into the narrative and level structure of the game, by the end of which you'll have all the levels and skill points needed to increase the skill set of your character, and considering Grey Wardens are blight ending, darkspawn defeating killing machines, with Bond-esque levels of charisma, or Big Brody-esque levels of intimidation that get them their way where swords would fail to do so, that is more true to the spirit of being a Grey Warden instead of raw statistical power. As a side note on level gating and level scaling, I will say I prefer level scaling as it allows the player more freedom of exploration and increases the replay value of a game by allowing the player to progress in different ways and complete objectives in different orders in subsequent playthroughs. Level gating is not bad outright, except for when a game does not allow the player to enter an area or level that the player is underleveled for. I understand wanting to protect the player from unfair negative experiences, but player level dictating access to an area is too restrictive generally speaking. There is a discussion to be had here about prescriptivism in games, but that is beyond the scope of this video. Most RPGs that don't do level scaling end up gating the player outright another way by making numbers matter far more than player skill, which I also generally dislike. The modern FromSoft games, for example, have level gating, or rather, do not employ level scaling, but I do not dislike it in those games as, if a player is skilled enough at the mechanics of the game, they can reasonably get through those areas and progress in the game as though it employed level scaling instead. Here, level gating is used to guide first-timers through the game down the path of least resistance, but can be shirked by more experienced players. While this is more restrictive, it is still in keeping with the freedom expected of the RPG genre, and is especially effective in the more action-oriented FromSoft games that rely more on animation frames, hitboxes, and universal system mechanics than a more traditional tactical RPG than Dragon Age Origins that rely more heavily on back-end mathematical checks and player stats. The middle of a blight is the worst time to tour the country, but as one of only 2 remaining Grey Wardens, it's a tour you must take, and it seems as though this blight in particular couldn't be at a worse time for Ferelden. Each city couldn't be more volatile, as on top of imminent civil war caused by civil unrest at the death of King Kalen, Ferelden cities themselves are facing their own internal plights. Lothering is suffering from a lack of resources from being pillaged and having its town pilfered by bandits, who subsequently keep supplies out of the town and people in. Inner city merchants have raised the prices of whatever goods they have left, adding on to the unrest of the already ill and starving people. There are refugees too in the town, from villages the Blight has overtaken and corrupted, creating tension between them and the locals as they compete for what little resources there are. The town is dirty and run down but small. Its people are sick and desperate, and while technically overpopulated, they are few relative to the other cities, making Lothering a great place to start the player to introduce them to the gameplay loop of Dragon Age Origins. It's the first area of the game you'll let loose in. Its small size lends to your experience there being an intimate one, as you try to ameliorate the terrible conditions of Lothering's people. Amelioration is the best you'll do though, because no matter how hard you try to mend these people's strife, it soon becomes overtaken by the Darkspawn as you move on to other places with people more important to your task at hand, leaving Lothering's people to die. Origins is an exceedingly dark game. As you move from town to town and city to city, you rarely ever see merriment or people just being genuinely happy, save for children who know no better. If you start as a human noble like I did, you begin the game with your sister-in-law and nephew being murdered in cold blood, having to fight your way through an invasion of your castle by your father's right-hand man, and being whisked away to become a Grey Warden to fight some greater evil than the one in your immediate vision, and in so doing leaving both of your parents to die. Your master and all your fellow Grey Wardens die as a ploy for a greedy man to become king, a greedy man who was established as the right hand and father-in-law to the current king, who was the prime victim of his ploy. All of your companions have some kind of baggage they hold with them that define their character in some way. There's racial tension everywhere, political unrest in every city, subterfuge, conspiracy, bouts for political power, and posturing everywhere. Redcliffe's people are almost all wiped out at the hands of an abomination. Orzammar's caste system resulted in an insane wealth and power gap between castes where, in a masterful touch, the noble dwarves of high caste live in the high areas of the underground city, the casteless people of Dusttown live in the lowest regions, and the merchant and labourer castes live in between the two layers. Continuing on into the deep roads and thags, you find out that the different races of Ferelden equate to the different type of darkspawn you fight in the game. Tainted humans become Hurlocks, Genlocks come from dwarves, Shrieks from elves, and ogres from Kunari. The Dalish elves are caught in the middle of a decades-long war with werewolves that has tainted much of the forest and resulted in the death of many of its animals. The game ends with you potentially having to sacrifice yourself, and with your best friend or lover leaving you, saying never to look for her. Origins is not a happy game, and Ferelden is a deeply flawed nation hiding behind a facade of having good values. The Chantry represents this best. In almost every town there are Chanter's boards that house short quests that can be done by the player, and are great for when they're in need of some quick cash. These quests also serve to communicate to the player a bit about the immediate plight of the current area they are in. Take Lothering for example. There were bandits terrorizing the town, and on the Chanter's board there's a quest to go kill them. They're like local quest boards or bounty boards that you find in most fantasy video games. Chanter's boards are put up by the Chantry, aka the religious institution of Thedas. The Chantry has a broad cultural reach which extends into politics and security, even having its own army of soldiers called Templars and mages called Magisters. Any person found to be capable of using magic is required by law to be shipped off to the Circle Tower of Mages to be trained and educated on the chant. Any mages unaccounted for are hunted by Templars, specifically trained for keeping mages in check, and provided any resistance, killed for mutiny. Because of the historically bad rep of mages, the chant is able to strengthen its goodwill with people by showing that it is able to exterminate the Maleficarum, while touting the effectiveness of its teachings by training their own mages who become soldiers and doctors, protecting mudbloods instead of subjugating them like mages of old. Chanter's boards, then, serve as another faculty of reinforcing belief in the chant. Put your problems on this board and the Chantry will solve them for you. It's an effective strategy, especially considering that one of the reasons people in real life lack faith in God is because of the perceived lack of direct influence he has in their lives on a moment-to-moment sense. Even though these problems aren't solved by Andraste herself, if you pitch it like she's listening to them and sending someone to solve your problems for you, that's kind of all people need to keep a basic amount of faith really. In fact, it isn't even really about citizens believing particularly in Andraste and the chant, but about returning to the institution of the Chantry and enabling their power, which, by doing the quests on the Chanter's board, you directly assist in. As an institution, they seem dubious and only concerned with perpetuating their power and extending their political reach. Apostates aren't evil mages, but are subjugated and hunted by Templars regardless, simply because of their unwillingness to be trained under the Chantry. Speaking further to their dubious nature, they would have you believe that Apostates and Maleficarum are one and the same, when Maleficarum are the ones who practice forbidden and taboo magic. They even go as far as forcing mages who seek reform to undergo the Rite of Tranquility, which cuts off the Malefica's connection to the Fade, where all the demons come from, preventing them from using the taboo magic, but in return makes them entirely devoid of emotion and feeling. If I felt pain, it is meaningless to me now. Once I knew only fear, but now I know only service. Whatever pain there was, I believe it an acceptable trait. I find it hard to put faith in any institution willing to quite literally destroy a person's humanity for the sake of making slaves, and makes me feel conflicted about doing the quest on their board in the first place. I am glad to have directly helped people who need it, but disgusted that I essentially assisted in perpetuating the power of the Chantry in a way I didn't have to. I saved the mages in Circle Tower, yeah, but that's because they were essential to saving Ferelden from complete ruin. Chanters board quests only serve to bolster belief in the Chant and the people's goodwill in the Chantry. Ultimately, the only thing that matters to them is control. Control over who uses magic and what magic they use, because it allows them to control the flow of information on mages and public opinion over them. I believe in the story of Andraste, but seriously screw the Chantry. Almost every faction in the game is like this, and you're forced to interact with them because of your mission. Circle Tower falling would be better for mages all around, but you have to save it or you have no organized group of mages to help you fight the Darkspawn. For both Redcliffe and Denerim, you help maintain the status quo, thereby doing nothing to improve the material conditions of the lower class people, and nothing to improve the human-elf race relations. You're constantly made to question if you're actually doing anything good by saving the backsides of these institutions, without really being able to leverage that to change them for the better, but you do it anyways because it's a lesser evil than having everyone die to the Blight. There are sometimes positive outcomes though. In Orzammar, you're forced to give your support to one of two parties vying for the throne so that their stalemate can end and they have the capacity to send soldiers your way to fight against the Blight. Balin is clearly the better choice, as he aims to bring reform to many of the outdated laws and traditions of Orzammar and to improve the conditions of the casteless, and in the epilogue, the Assembly of Nobles, whose only goal was to perpetuate their status, was dissolved, leaving Balin to rule on his own. A monarchy is still bad, but at least Balin wants to improve the lives of his most needy subjects. And if you end the curse and the war between the Dalish elves and the werewolves, a new leader is chosen for the elves who works to improve human-elf relations, instead of perpetuating how bad they are like the one she replaces. It should be noted that these outcomes vary based on your starting class and other choices made, and that, from a quick read of the wiki, the majority of outcomes are almost flatly bad. In a way, Ferelden's rulers are the real villains of the game, as their choices impede your goals, making them more antagonistic figures than the Darkspawn themselves, which are inherently evil and do what is in their nature to do. The rulers of Ferelden, on the other hand, have the capacity to do good and be better like every other person, so when it is that they commit evil, it's far more poignant, particularly because it is their choice to do so. Loghain chose to leave King Cailan and the Grey Wardens to die, and chose to slander their names. Alhau chose to kill the Kuzlans and the people of Highever. The Dwarven rulers chose to do nothing about the caste system in Orzammar, leaving the casteless to rot and die in Dusttown. The merchants in Lothering chose to artificially inflate their goods prices despite the suffering and poverty of its people. The bandits chose to tyrannize the people of Lothering. The Chantry chooses to kill apostates, chooses to remove the humanity of Malefica, and chooses to obfuscate the difference between the two. Humans choose to be prejudiced against elves and treat them like second-class citizens, who themselves choose to teach hatred over forgiveness, however understandable that might be. Zathian chose not to remove the curse on the werewolves after decades. The werewolves chose to kill any elves wandering the forest out of revenge. The leaders of Ferelden are the entire reason you have to go out of your way to ask them to honor the treaties, and who impede your confidence that saving Ferelden is a good thing in the first place, not the Darkspawn. Their choices reflect the history of war and conquest upon which Ferelden was built, and the kind of learned hatred that hundreds of years of war and conquest teaches. Even after uniting the forces of Ferelden to fight against the Darkspawn, you don't get the feeling that anything is better or would progress in that way, and that the rulers of Ferelden are doomed to repeat their history. It's an alliance built out of necessity and out of a mutual hatred after all, not one of a mutual goal of betterment. But where the people, factions, and goings-on of Ferelden may be dark and terrible, Ferelden is not without beauty. The few houses cascading down the cliffside and amalgamating with the more clustered ones near the lake by the docks in Redcliffe Village are picturesque and a real showcase of human adaptability and resilience. The densely packed, multi-storied buildings, meters-high walls, and castles of Denerim give the place a larger-than-life quality even though you only get to explore a fraction of it. The rich and lush Brazilian forest, with its drooping vines, its uneven undulating terrain, divided by its many rivers and waterfalls, with stone pillars, arches, and other remains of prior civilization, has a surreal and otherworldly beauty to it, despite the presence of familiar fauna. Traversing through here felt incredible. Ozama is one of my favorite areas in a game I've played, despite its terrible socio-political conditions. It is wonderfully crafted. I love the giant interconnected structures, how the blazing fire in the braziers with dwarven faces, the radiant lava flowing through the structures, and the luminous blue-green lyrium veins channeled through the walls contrast with the dull stone construction. The giant statues of dwarves in the noble area convey a great sense of power, and combined with the complexity of it all, does well to showcase the skill and craftsmanship the dwarves tout themselves as having. I seriously love underground cities and want to see more of them in media. Ozama from this game and Zion from the Matrix movies are basically my two favorite places ever aesthetically. Lost Izalith would be too if it was finished. If you know any more games, shows, or movies with cool underground cities, let me know. However I might have been let down by Ferelden's people and its societal structures and conditions as motivations for saving it, the natural beauty of its lands is untouched by civilization, and the rich cultural artifact of those civilizations themselves provided enough motivation for me to continue saving it. The atmosphere in this game is near unparalleled and is greatly assisted by the incredible soundtrack. You might not find bangers here that are capable of standing purely on their own, but like a song you grew up listening to, or a song that played when you had your first kiss, the music in Dragon Age Origins has a nostalgic quality to it and distinct memories of your playthrough flash in your mind when you listen to its tracks after it's all said and done. Some highlights for me are the Calenhad Docks theme, the Dalish Camp theme, the Ozama Merchant theme, and the main theme, and there's more in the description. It also sells the high fantasy incredibly well, with intricate orchestral themes everywhere. Regal horns for city areas and triumphant moments, string instruments for more somber and chilled out tones, bells and woodwinds help with creating mystery and intrigue, choirs for tense sequences with danger around every corner. It's incredible work, worthy of being in something with as much renown as the Lord of the Rings trilogy or the Hobbit movies. Origin's level of darkness is oppressive at times, and that might be a turn-off for you, but I think it enhances the flavor of the game, requiring you to be a bit of an optimist to persevere through a situation as impossibly bleak and seemingly insurmountable as this. Its bleak tone also helps to highlight the times when there's genuine moments of happiness, like Sten's reaction when you find his sword, or Alistair's when you find his special amulet, or when you help Dagna live her dream of studying magic at the Circle Tower. The moment where Alistair gives you a rose as a female warden. Even though your time with Morrigan ends on a sour note, gaining her trust and becoming better friends with her, and eventually having her open up to you saying you're her first true friend, was a moment of satisfaction and joy for me. It's those small moments that kept me going in this game despite its overwhelmingly bleak nature, and while Ferelden never becomes better off despite your efforts and was only reset to a stable state, those small moments of joy stick with me more than the bleak result at the game's end, and preserving the beauty of the Brazilian forest and the wonderfully crafted underground city of Ozama is enough satisfaction for me. Along with you on your journey are various party members which you can meet at different locations throughout the game. The tutorial sections partner you up with a couple throwaway guys, but the first real mainstay party members are Alistair and Morrigan. Alistair is an exemplary warrior with a strong but naive sense of justice, and is generally an awkward, somewhat witless and unconfident person. He was trained as a Templar as a young boy, and so displays great combat prowess, but is the bastard child of an Arl who was thrown by the wayside to avoid scandal, and so yearns for love, acceptance, and guidance. Gameplay-wise, Alistair is a warrior, focusing on tanking, removing debuffs, and is excellent at shutting down enemy mages. He was a mainstay party member for me largely because of how good his Templar skills are, and for exceedingly funny moments where he was the target of other party members' teasing. Alistair is almost a true main character of Origins, as a lot of the game's main plot elements revolved around him as much as they do you, and this is especially the case if you play as a female warden like I did. As a male warden, you display more combat prowess and social competence than he does, so you end up being chosen over him for many of the game's important moments. And so the perspective of Alistair potentially changes for you with the gender of the warden in an interesting way. As a female warden, he's a lovable idiot and secondary main character, with equal importance placed on him as is placed on you, who overcomes his emotional hang-ups out of love for you. As a male warden, he's a beta male for you to cuck out of all of his opportunities and fulfill your power fantasy. That, or you're effectively an older brother figure to him, guiding him to be the best version of himself. Overall, I think the game plays better when you're a female warden because your roles in the narrative conflict a lot less. Morrigan is an incredibly powerful witch with the ability to shapeshift into various animal forms, making her an incredibly useful ally. Being an apostate, an unregistered magic user untrained by the Templars, Morrigan has been hunted, subjugated, and sequestered from other people by her mother her entire life, leading her to be very cold and unsociable at the beginning of the game. Because she's so closed off when you first meet her, I had a really enjoyable time earning her trust and breaking down the walls she had built up. She has great banter with the rest of the cast, who often allow her to showcase her wit, especially whenever she makes a target of Alistair. I enjoyed her interactions with Sten as well, who seemed to be her intellectual weakness because of his very literal understanding of human shorthand and ability to dish back whatever was thrown at him. Morrigan is also exceedingly powerful in combat, with great crowd control that becomes pivotal at the endgame, alongside her ability to debuff and demobilize even the strongest of enemies. Great both in combat and out of it, she's a character I'm likely to remember for the rest of my life. Great performance by a voice actor as well. Sten is the first non-human party member the player can encounter in the game, as well as the first optional one. He is a Kunari, a race not well explored in the first game, but that will be seen more of in the subsequent ones. The player first meets Sten, imprisoned for killing a family, and has the option to free him, allowing him a chance at redemption and providing a service to Ferelden. Or they can leave him in his cage to die, either by public execution or to the Darkspawn, soon to bring reckoning to the village he is in. Being of a race not even accessible to the player on character creation, Sten brings a unique flavor to the party through the various ways he expresses and practices his novel Kunari culture and the interesting ways the Kunari experience makes him different from the player and the other party members. Sten is stoic and has a very strong sense of ethics unique to the Kunari people, which also affects his standards for a respectable person, which you would think makes leveling his approval rating particularly difficult, but I had a fairly easy time doing it naturally in my playthrough. Similarly to Morrigan, he's incredibly witty, but seems to fail to understand a lot of human cultural context and sarcasm, which makes for some funny moments where a character's teasing goes over his head and he responds very literally, accidentally winning some of his exchanges. Sten is a Kunari warrior focusing on tanking, drawing aggro with low DPS, but high damage on his slow but deliberate attacks. He was a mainstay in my party for the early game, but was replaced by the next character once I had unlocked them. If I ever play this game again, I'll definitely keep him in my party for the entire playthrough. The next party member is Shale, a rock golem, and just like Sten, is a race the character cannot access during character creation, making them similarly novel to Sten. Shale is incredibly sassy, strong-minded, proud, and a bit prejudiced, but that's understandable considering they have a very cool and clearly superior rock body and aren't some squishy flesh creature like the rest of us. Golem supremacy, am I right? Shale is the oldest party member in the game, and though they've seen a lot of the game's backstory and lore having existed for hundreds of years, is only able to remember the last 30 or so of their existence. Shale becomes a party member after the player awakens them from their slumber in the town where their previous master lived. After finding out the control rod, which to its wielder allows absolute control over Shade, stops working, they're forced to reckon with having agency for the first time in their existence, and decides to roll with the player for having freed them until they find a purpose in life. Shale is a golem warrior focusing on crowd control, close quarters combat, range combat, tanking, dealing elemental damage, and drawing aggro. The banter between Shale, Morrigan, and Alistair was so good, I couldn't help but keep those three in my party for the rest of the game. Not to mention how good of a team comp a rogue player character, warrior Alistair, golem warrior Shale, and mage Morrigan made. If you play a rogue class in this game, that's a comp right there. Shale also calls everyone it, and I enjoyed the subversion of human gender norms and the irony of a genderless entity using genderless pronouns on gendered beings. Other party members include Ogren, a dwarven warrior characterized as a slightly undignified drunkard, frat guy type dude, down for any and everything. Liliana, a rogue bard whose dodgy past is hidden by her joining the Chantry and becoming an effective nun. She's a mainstay character of the DragonAge series who becomes a super important character later on. Wynn, a humble old witch and instructor at the Circle Tower of Mages whose extenuating circumstances lead her to fight alongside the player, and Zevran, an elf dude, an optional party member who I don't know jack about because I just told him to buzz off after he tried to kill me. Sorry. There's also a secret companion, but I don't know how you get him to join your party. He's an older Grey Warden, more experienced than both you and Alistair, that you can rescue from Owl House prison in one of the later quests in the game. With all these characters, Dragon Age Origins offers the player a wide variety of personalities to experience and interact with, and diverse ways to play and enjoy the game. One criticism to be made, however, not only of Dragon Age Origins, but of much of Tolkien-inspired fantasy media in general, is that it is characteristically white. Even though Dragon Age Origins features a diverse cast of party members of all walks of life and fantasy races, it is not exempt from this characteristic whiteness. There is not a single character in this game that isn't an analogue of a white person of real human description. There are no black people, no brown people, or people of indigenous or Asian description. It bewilders me how one would have the imagination required to create an entire world of fantasy denizens, tall and short, fat and skinny, muscular and frail, with and without horns, claws and paws, pointed and rounded ears, with and without long beards and hair of every hue and color imaginable, imagining a culture without religion but of revering citizens of great accomplishment and service to the history and culture of a race, imagining a culture of an obfuscated and militaristic religion that is used to control and subjugate those who prove a danger to the average person and establishment, but because of its ability to unite people, works to an extent to preserve peace, imagining cultures based on more traditional, indigenous-inspired form of religion, with elders who educate and guide and form complex hierarchical systems, where glory differs but everyone is a useful and respected member of the community, where animals are given the same level of respect as another person, but completely and utterly fail to think of giving any of the human or human-adjacent races different skin colors. Dark elves don't count, by the way. It's funny that the game even allows you to darken the skin of your character in character creation, but you will never see another human or human-adjacent character in the entire game that looks like you if you do this. I roleplayed as an OC of mine who has lighter skin, and so they don't look very different from the other characters of the game, but I can imagine how damaging to my experience it would be if I wanted to play as a character who looked more like me in real life. There would be no character in the game with skin as dark as mine, and I couldn't even give them hair with my texture at all if I wanted to. The whiteness of fantasy media is a characteristic that needs to die if the genre wishes to be anything other than Tolkien-inspired and wants to be more appealing to non-white people. Recently, there was an image circulating on Twitter of a black dwarven woman featured in a reboot of a traditionally white fantasy media franchise, some of the responses to which highlight the negative effects of this characteristic whiteness of the genre. People see traditional fantasy as being white media, and to bring blackness into it, as was the case with this image, is to soil the genre with the modern leftist agenda, when in reality there was no reason for there to be no analogues to other real-life skin colors in the human/human-adjacent races of fantasy media, especially when there is no in-universe reason for it to be this way, like the climate of an area affecting the pigmentation of skin or something like that. The human and human-adjacent races in fantasy media are white just because. Breaking away from this does not at all take away from the qualities of the genre, rather enhances its already present quality of being extremely diverse, broadening its audience in the process. This is especially disappointing for a game that allows the player to engage in non-hetero relationships and already has great homosexual representation in 2009. Another criticism to be made is of the approval rating system and how it is presented to the player. The purpose of the approval rating system is to assist in making you feel like the leader of your party. All of your party members have an approval rating, which will be shown to AR for the sake of brevity, which indicates how much they like or dislike you. It is shown under every party member's portrait in select menu screens as a scale of -100 to +100. Acts taken by the player can influence a member's AR positively or negatively, and what impacts this is unique to every party member. Some of them understand and value the time-sensitive mission you are on, and will disapprove of helping individuals who have no power over their people to convince them to aid you in the battle against the Darkspawn, whereas more sensitive or sentimental characters approve of you helping everyday men and women if you can. A character disapproving of your actions drops their AR by some amount, where an approval increases their AR. Whenever this happens, some text pops up on the bottom left of the screen saying whether a party member approves or disapproves of an act and by how much. I hate that it does this. Dragon Age Origins, you are a video game. Show me when a character approves or disapproves of my actions, do not tell me using some on-screen text. If you think I'm being unreasonable, imagine you were playing The Last of Us, and when Joel's daughter gets shot in the opening of the game, there's some text that displays in the subtitles along the lines of, Joel's brows become furrowed, his eyes fill with tears and he frowns, with Joel's in-game model just doing his idle animation or something. Is that not completely egregious? That's how I feel whenever this game and other RPGs do this. Video games are an audio-visual medium. Use that to your advantage and show me when a character does or does not like a thing I do. It's such a strange decision to make in a game full of interactive cutscenes. The number popping up on screen is very literal and clear information, but numbers aren't a substitute for the kind of simulated human interaction they were attempting. It makes the player treat the characters not as people, but as the approval rating itself if the only feedback they get from making a decision is that number going up or down, instead of adding to the sense of being a leader where your decisions have an impact on your party members' feelings about you. A few animations where a character smiles or folds their arms or shakes their head, while rudimentary, would add so much more to the feeling of them being real people in this virtual world instead of a number represented by an avatar. There's a case to be made about accessibility, especially regarding those with Asperger's and autism who have trouble accurately reading the facial expressions of people, but in that case you could just make it an accessibility option instead of having it on by default and rarely ever doing the alternative. My problems don't stop there though. Too low of an AR causes a party member to leave, but a high AR unlocks permanent buffs and opens up romances and party member specific quests, which is a good mechanic and those quests are actually pretty good. On paper, it is a dynamic system that allows for role-playing and player expression as to what kind of leader you are, and enhancing the interactivity between you and your party members by having them respond to you as dictated by how much they like or dislike you. But as you'll experience while playing the game, it often only amounts to a number increasing or decreasing, and some on-screen text to indicate this. The only things of impact that happen regarding the AR system only occur at the extreme ends. Extremely low AR and your party members become passive-aggressive at worst, or even low and they threaten to leave. High AR has them greet you with some sing-song in their voice, and super high AR has select party members wanting to bed you. There were a couple instances where the party responses felt dynamic, like when Alistair presses you on how you dealt with Al Eamon and Alessa Isolde's son becoming an abomination, or Sten being the only character in my playthrough who ever questioned my authority or ability to lead, even attacking me at one point. But both instances happened regardless of their AR. Any changes to party member behavior actually based on AR are incredibly superficial, and never once throughout the game did I feel like I was pressed by one of them to change how I play in order to make them feel more represented or respected by my decisions. Unless their AR is so bad as for them to want to leave you, they follow you basically unquestioningly and never exercise their own agency by not doing something that I ask or doing something that I don't approve of. They never take charge on an issue they care about, they never stay out of things they disapprove of doing, and you often cannot ask directly how they feel about a certain circumstance the party is in. There are select moments where your decision can make a party member leave immediately, but these happen regardless of their AR and aren't dynamic. They are fixed moments in the game's story with no real build-up towards them. Consequently, the AR system feels useless, as it is severely lacking in any real gameplay consequence, especially on the negative end, and feels too much like it is in service of the player. It takes away from the characters, leaving them feeling more like NPCs in a video game than real people on your journey alongside you, especially when their approval can be so easily bought with thoughtful gifts. Those are very, very cheap, and you could buy a bunch of them, easily. You can play the entire game being uncaring of anyone but yourself and suffer no consequences because the AR system is terrible at enforcing them. The AR system is lucky that the banter that the characters have amongst each other is so well written that it saves them from the character death it would bring otherwise. I really want to stress how much this system doesn't work the way it attempts to. It's one of the staple systems of the game, as all of your decisions hinge on someone's AR going up or down. It's how the game tries to make you feel like a leader by making your decisions affect the people closest to you in it. I'll illustrate this failure using an anecdote from my playthrough. On your journey throughout Ferelden, you will come across abominations, which are people possessed by demons of the Fade, and because of how dangerous they are, must be immediately dealt with. There is such an instance in Redcliffe Castle where you and your party goes in hopes to find out about the poisoned Al Eamon and to see how you can help him recover. There you meet Kana and Alessa Isolde, Imun's son and wife respectively. Kana has been possessed by a Fade demon, thus becoming an abomination, and there are two ways of dealing with him. I quickly want to stress how dangerous Kana is. He is responsible for the devastation of the castle people and for wiping out many of Redcliffe's soldiers and townspeople. The first way, and the way most common to the people of Ferelden, you can deal with him is to straight up kill him. The second, more emergent way, requires doing a blood ritual to send a Magister into the Fade to kill the demon, exorcising it in the process. This requires someone who knows blood magic to conduct the ritual, which we have, another Magister to enter the Fade, which we also have, and a ton of lyrium to act as a source of power for the ritual, which we don't have. Alternatively, someone can be sacrificed in order to perform the ritual successfully to save Kana. When Alessa Isolde hears the suggestion of the blood ritual, she willingly offers herself as a sacrifice to save her son, making my decision an easy one. There's a lot of nuance to this situation I'm skipping over because it's not pertinent to my point, but I want to say this is an excellent scenario thus far. The quests in this game are generally great. I'm set on doing the blood ritual, but I'm willing to change my mind if the mage in my party refuses to go into the Fade to kill the demon. They have to do it by themselves, and it's an extremely dangerous endeavor, so I'd understand opting to kill Kana here in punchable space instead, with a lot of fighters in the room as backup should things go awry. Morrigan is the only mage in my party, thus is the only one who can enter the Fade to kill the demon possessing Kana. I tried to talk with her to see if she is willing to go or not. If I engage her in conversation, my only option regarding the circumstance is to ask if the blood ritual would work, so I asked that. She tells me it would, but nothing about how she feels about the situation at hand, and I can't ask her that directly. She makes no comments about it either when the suggestion is first brought up. So I make the decision to do the ritual and have her enter the Fade, and Morrigan scathingly likens our relationship to that of a master and slave reluctantly entering the Fade. If anyone makes a remark like that about your relationship, you'd think that's pretty bad, right? And that serious change would need to happen for reparations to your relationship to be made. So I made the decision to send her into the spirit realm by herself to kill a super dangerous demon, and she is understandably pissed about it. You know how much her AR goes down by? 1. It goes down by 1 on a scale of -100 to +100. This is exactly what I mean by the AR system being in service of the player by being completely inconsequential. There is extreme dissonance between the emotions of the character and the consequence of the AR. That response she made could have actually been a moment of success for the game if I had been allowed to ask Morrigan beforehand about sending her into the Fade. That could have been a chance to hurt the player for leading undemocratically and not being concerned about their party members' feelings. Instead, it ruins the entire gameplay scenario because on one hand, there was nothing I could do to prevent the response, and on the other, doing so wouldn't have mattered anyways because I would receive no negative penalty. This was incredibly damaging to my expectations of this system and its potential. It's something I hope they improve on in the future games, and something they need to do to elevate this game from being good to genuinely incredible. Consequence is a major theme in Dragon Age Origins, but before you suffer consequences for your actions, you must choose. It is your main gameplay verb as a player. Before the game starts proper, you choose your race, class, how you look, where you start the game. In it, you choose which party members to take along your journey, and choose whether you want to increase their AR or not. You choose your weapons and what skills and talents you level. You choose the order of cities you go, the order of completion of quests. At times, you are allowed to choose who lives and dies. As stated previously, Ferelden and its people are in conflict because of the choices of its leaders. Choice is present everywhere in the game, and the end of each quest marks the beginning of consequence. You often get to choose the consequences suffered, which reflects on your personhood and morality, and is another element of role-playing present in the game. Everyone in the game is brought to term in some way, and no one is devoid of consequence. Al-Hal, who murdered the Kuzlan family in the opening sequence of my playthrough, was eventually brought to term by me later on in the game where I killed him. Not solely out of revenge, but because he took prisoners and tortured them, made slaves of people, and because he sided with the faction who had failed to save Ferelden from the Darkspawn. Keeper Zathrian of the Dalish Elves cursed a group of humans who hatefully raped and killed his family to become savage werewolves and refused to remove it for decades. This created a great deal of conflict between the Dalish and the werewolves, culminating in a violent feud between the two for just as long. The humans who committed the first sin have since died, suffering the consequence for their actions. Zathrian is still alive, yet to suffer any consequences directly, but his people, dying in the fight and some becoming werewolves themselves, are paying his price for him. For example, you meet a couple in the Dalish camp torn apart because one of them had become a werewolf. At the end of the quest in the Brazilian forest, you choose who you side with between the Dalish elves and the werewolves. Siding with the werewolves means killing the rest of the elves and having them fight with you in the final battle instead. In this case, the consequence is retribution for kissing the humans. Siding with the elves means killing the werewolves, vindicating Zathrian's choice all those years ago. There's a third choice where, after first hearing the werewolves up, you can convince Zathrian to end the curse and cure both sides' people. It takes a bit more effort to achieve, but this is the resolution I sought after, and I was happy the game allowed me to do so. The first two endings are all about retributive justice, which I am morally opposed to. The humans who had wronged Zathrian are already dead, so I didn't see the point in continuing the feud any longer, and fought to end it peacefully. In convincing Zathrian to end the curse, you also convince him of his wrongdoings in cursing the humans in the first place, and in perpetuating the feud. Ending the curse for the werewolves and healing the tainted elves and animals results in Zathrian dying, but not before coming to terms with the death of his family and making peace with the werewolves. His death, then, is not retributive, whatever satisfaction it may bring to some of the werewolves, but one of self-sacrifice, and whatever wrong was undone and peace was made. The humans go to Denerim and Redcliffe, and a new, more promising keeper is chosen for the Dalish elves. You as a player are made to have a say in so much of the game's big decisions and solve basically all of its problems that it made me feel too important while making everyone else seem a bit too incompetent. Without you finding Branka, the Orzammar dwarves wouldn't have settled their political stalemate. You also get to choose who becomes king, not through whose campaign you support like the quest began as, but they just flatly make you decide between the two at the end of the main quest in Orzammar. Why does my character get to make this decision when the dwarves are so insular about their politics? It doesn't really make sense. You solve all of the game's problems in an extreme power fantasy of being a low-key Jesus figure to Ferelden. If you're into that kind of escapism, then this game would work great for you, but the sheer importance of my character and the scale of my feats left me feeling like it was all too much. I felt like if I read about my own acts in this game in a history book, it would read more like a myth than history, and I would question the credibility of the authors immediately. I personally enjoy a kind of groundedness in my media, which the game provides in every other aspect of itself, but when it was all said and done, I felt too much like Kirito from Sword Art Online, or Tatsuya Shibuya from Mahoka Koko no Retose. Too much like Jesus-kun, you know? When I said no one was devoid of consequence, I meant no one, not even the player character, and your consequences occur in the Landsmeet quest. The Landsmeet quest involves a series of smaller quests that all take place in Denerim, and certain choices you make culminate into the final sequence of the quest, the Landsmeet. In one of those quests, you and Alistair are jailed, and you have to play as two other members of your party as they bust you out. In your cell, Alistair asks you if you think any of the party members will come to rescue you, and your responses dictate who you play as in the rescue. I digress there. I thought this was just a cool moment I felt I had to mention. The Landsmeet itself is a summit of all the rulers of Ferelden, where a new king is to be decided. In the running is Loghain MacTair, the main antagonist of the game, and Alistair, whom Al Eamon wishes to have appointed so that the Grey Wardens have complete control in the strategy of the battle against the Darkspawn and the Archdemon. In order to win the Landsmeet, you need enough support from the right people, as certain groups or individuals' vote mean more than others, with a Norris support counting for the most, but not mandatory for the win. Your decisions in the smaller quests prior to the meet influences who supports you when the vote is called, that or you have good enough arguments to overturn support for Loghain. Naturally, the odds are stacked against you because of Loghain's smear campaign, so it is important that you make choices not in your own personal interests in these smaller quests, but choices that best represent the interests of the leaders present in the Landsmeet. My favorite thing about these smaller quests is that these choices I keep talking about are not at all signposted as being able to help you win the Landsmeet, rather arising separately from the main quest objective, changing the quest from busywork to an opportunity to gain support. For example, during the quest where the main objective was rescuing Anora, you find another prisoner in House Dungeon that is the brother of Alfstana. He's delirious as a result of Illyrium withdrawals, and instead of asking you to free him, he requests that you give a ring to his sister, who you find out is a noble at the Landsmeet. You then leverage the ring to gain her support. The other quests are just like this, and it's genius. As you do quest after quest and make choices that result in you finding things you can leverage to gain support, you feel more in tune with the game and the situation your character is in than you would if each quest was flatly about gaining support. Even though the game primes you into thinking about ways you can gain more support for the Landsmeet, you don't know that you'd find opportunities going into these quests, so when you do coming out of them, it's deeply satisfying because it feels like you earned these opportunities yourself, and that's what games, and especially RPGs, are all about. Speaking of what games are all about, the Landsmeet itself. Surprisingly, to me at least, it plays out like any other dialogue sequence / interactive cutscene in the game. It takes place in this giant room with Loghain on one end, the various nobles and leaders in the rafters on the sides of the room, and you and your party on the other end. When you enter the room, Loghain accosts you and begins the debate proper. He'll make accusations against and point out failures of the Grey Wardens, and you have to make cases for yourself and for your party, and against him. You'll trade rebuttals back and forth, with chimes here and there from individuals in the rafters to indicate how well you're doing as you go along. In the end, all the parties state their vote and you win or lose. It's a lengthy sequence and the best use of dialogue choices in a game I've ever played. It combines all of your choices in the quest leading up to it, reflecting who supports you going into the meet, what stats you choose to level up, and what skill trees you level into, dictating how difficult it is for you to persuade the audience of nobles and leaders. Your individual argumentative skills and ability to read the room reflect what dialogue options you choose, and how well you pick your arguments for yourself and against Loghain. The entire scene plays out using only the mechanics the player has been interacting with the entire game, which is excellent. The whole thing is very reminiscent of Shakespearean spectacle, where all the characters of his plays gather at the final act to hash out their shit and resolve the conflict of the play. For that, it has special suction with me as a Shakespeare enjoyer. It's genius, but it doesn't end there. If you lose the debate and the vote, Loghain tries to have you killed for your so-called crimes, and a battle between his group and the Warden's party ensues. Alternatively, if you win, you have the choice of attacking him and his men, resulting in the same battle. Otherwise, the Grand Cleric suggests that the matter be resolved in a duel between Loghain and a member of the Warden's party. Both results end in this duel, a trial by combat. Is that not the coolest shit ever? Loghain is defeated and you are now the winner of the Landsmeet proper. Some stuff happens and you have to choose after the duel to kill Loghain or to make him a Grey Warden. Making him a Grey Warden has some implications for the final battle, where you learn that a Grey Warden must be sacrificed to kill the Archdemon. Meaning, saving Loghain now would mean that neither you nor Alistair has to die, but you don't know that when you have to make this decision. I initially chose to make him a Grey Warden, again because I'm not about that retributive justice here, and even on easy he was a difficult fight, and I decided I needed every body possible for the final fight of the game. Choosing to save Loghain despite all of his actual crimes and the bodies he's piled up pisses off Alistair so much that he denounces your relationship and leaves the party entirely. That immediately caused me to regret my decision. I personally despise Loghain and only save him because of my values. Causing a person I actually like to leave made me reset my save for the first time in the game in order to kill Loghain and keep Alistair in my party. Tarbuk, if you're watching this. That brings me to my final discussion about choice and consequence, on the merits and demerits of being able to reload your save at any time in a choice-driven RPG, and its implications on free will. RPGs are typically incredibly long games, especially those with branching storylines and different endings that arise as a result of your choices as a player, and players often want to experience all of those different branches and endings, and so being able to reload your save at any time means being able to experience all of the game with as little friction and time investment possible. This is great for players whose responsibilities and obligations make it so that they can't reasonably replay the game multiple times to experience its variants, or for those who just don't have the patience to. A downside, I would argue, of this system is that it also allows you to negate any unwanted consequences by reloading your save to make choices that give you the ones you do want. I think this cheapens the purpose of having to make choices in the game in the first place that don't all lead to the same outcome. I admit it was a failure on my part to forget to impose upon myself a restriction to do this, but this is essentially the first game I've played like this to conclusion that didn't have a single overwriting autosave. Those games made me face the consequences of my actions, and while they were never as unsavory as the two consequences that made me want to reload my save in Origins, I felt those experiences were more true to the aspect of role-playing by not allowing me to overturn my choice, thereby doing something that I would do, but that my character wouldn't do. A single save that overwrites itself allows for a player to be better in tune with their character by outright removing the ability to do otherwise, thereby emphasizing the consequence of a player's choice, which is what I think people really want when they play RPGs, or at least what I want. By allowing the player the ability to do otherwise, the largely agreed upon definition of free will, Origins has removed a kind of moral responsibility from the player. Remember, to have the freedom to do otherwise consists in more than the mere possibility of something else happening. And since Origins quite literally gives you the ability to make something else happen by reloading your save, you definitionally have been granted free will by the game, but at the cost of the player's moral accountability. In discussion of moral responsibility as it relates to free will, there lies three kinds of it: moral answerability, moral attributability, and of course, moral accountability. Being able to reload your save has no impact on a player's moral answerability because it does not impede their ability to explain why they made the choices they did. I reloaded my save so as to prevent Alistair from leaving my party, and because of my personal indifference to Logain's life, regardless of my own moral predilections. Being able to reload your save has no bearing on a player's moral attributability because it does not prevent their actions from being labeled for what they are. My killing Logain could be labeled as morally dubious or as a moral failing on my part. Being able to reload your save, however, does have an impact on your moral responsibility, as doing this prevents the game from enforcing any consequences to your actions. By reloading my save, the consequence for making Logain a Grave Warden was removed. I wasn't even offered the ability to be absolved of my actions. I shirked them, absolutely. This, on top of the lack of negative consequences regarding the approval rating system, explains so well why I didn't feel at all like a leader throughout most of my playthrough, despite that being the primary goal of the game's narrative and systems. On these two levels, Dragon Age Origins fails at accomplishing its primary goal. All in all, choice and consequence is a theme I think the game explores well. From being one of the player's main gameplay verbs, to emphasizing the importance of consequence to the narrative and quest of the game, I think it does justice to the theme as much as it could, with the exception of being able to reload your save at any time, negating some of the moral accountability of the player by not allowing them to suffer any unwanted negative consequences for poor choices they can make. Dragon Age Origins is an action RPG with a tactical pause feature and some strategy elements. I have a large background in fighting games, character action games, and shooters, so my main concern for any game outside those genres with real-time combat is how satisfying they feel to play. This game is no substitute for those others, but the combat in real time feels okay. The animations are somewhat fluid and have some weight to them, enemy hit reactions aren't crazy or minion number and function, but combined with the sound effects and damage numbers, do well enough to sell the impact of every hit and the killing intent behind them. Heavier weapons like mauls and great axes suffer a bit in this regard, with their animations being a bit weightless and the hit reactions being the same for every other weapon in the game, so there's some improvement to be done there. Because they felt so weak in comparison, I tried not to use these with my characters if I could. All classes of weapons play functionally the same, as this is a kind of action game where numbers and sight lines matter and the animations are only there as a visual flourish and have little impact on the gameplay itself. An enemy can be several feet away from your sword swing, but if they were in its effective range by the time the animation was okayed by the game to happen, damage is still dealt. Arrows still hit even though the enemy has moved a great deal away from its initial target, though the game cheats by making arrows curve ridiculous amounts in midair to reach its target. Origins is better about this kind of thing than most games I've played, particularly when it comes to attacks with areas of effect or ones with particularly long animations. Both of those behave the way you think they would, where anything in its effective range during its time being active is properly included in the damage calculation or resulting effect. For most attacks in the game though, this feeling that everything is somewhat predetermined persists. This makes for combat that isn't anywhere near satisfying to play moment to moment, nor as physically enjoyable to play as a Dark Souls or a Nier Automata, and while I prefer Origins' style of combat less, not all games can or should be like the ones I named, and Dragon Age Origins is still alright for what it is. What Origins may lack in a visceral sensation of excellent real-time combat, it makes up for by having an incredibly deep and varied combat system. Strategy is the name of the game in Origins, and it excels in this regard. While there are only 3 classes, each class has different specializations that create distinct styles within each of them. Think of it like Ryu and Ken from Street Fighter. Both of them would be put under the Shoto class, but Ryu's specialization would be mid-range zoner because of his great footsie normals and excellent fireballs, whereas Ken's specialization would be offensive rushdown because of combo ability and better movement tools. These are fairly reductive and incomplete descriptions. Even though they're in the same class with similar tools, their effective ranges and positions are different, as well as their game plans. Origins features an extensive skill tree for each class, bringing greater variety within shared classes, and because each party member levels different branches of these trees, all of them feel distinct from each other. Take Alistair and Sten for example. They're both warriors but play very differently. Alistair is great at tanking damage, removing debuffs from party members, and taking out mages. This is because he particularizes sword and board combat via the weapon and shield skill tree, and has the Templar specialization. Sten, on the other hand, is great at buffing his own damage, breaking through enemy defenses, granting penalties to enemy damage, and drawing aggro. Sten instead concentrates on wielding great weapons via the two-handed weapons skill tree and has no specialization. Though they belong to the same class, their particular skill sets see them serving different roles in battle. One party member may be skilled in making healing items, another skilled in making bombs and poisons. One might be skilled in making a variety of traps, or detecting enemies' presences from far distances or through walls, and notifying you on your minimap, or skilled at pickpocketing or lockpicking and stealth and so on. All party members, including those with the same class, are like this, meaning there's no redundancy between them, and they remain equally valuable in combat. An excellent choice for a game where your party members are supposed to feel more like comrades than units in an RTS game. As a party of 4 or less, but I wouldn't recommend that, you'll be facing hordes of enemies on your path to saving Ferelden. Be that darkspawns, giant spiders, wolves, werewolves, ents, though they don't call them that, revenants, ghosts, demons, even humans, elves, dwarves, and golems. Chances are, if there's a model in game for it, you'll be fighting it, and your position as a Grey Warden means that you have a license to kill, but you don't always have to. It's not a decision the game lets you flat out make every combat encounter, but there are times where combat situations lead to foes surrendering, and the game lets you choose whether they live or die. These don't always lead to some crazy change gameplay or story-wise, but they don't have to. It's a nice choice to have, and refreshing in a landscape of games all about constant violence, and while violence is a capital M main verb allotted to the player, the choice of keeping someone alive is enhanced by it. The choice not to kill whenever you're allowed to make it is a choice I think is pretty valuable purely for role-playing purposes, and especially when, in-game, there's anti-Grey Warden propaganda being spread. Deciding not to kill someone is a choice I feel a duty to make, in the hopes of improving public opinion on the Wardens, no matter how futile that decision might be, in light of it having no real effect on the game in that way. I think it heightens the quality of the choice being there in the first place, as there's no morality system in Origins as compared to something like Mass Effect, meaning your decision to kill or keep someone alive is purely a reflection of you as a person. It's intrinsic. You kill or keep alive because of your own morality or your own opinion about the person at your mercy, and not necessarily influenced by a mechanic directly associated with your choice. A party member might dislike your choice, so in select cases leave the party entirely, but because there's someone else with you that would be indifferent to, or even celebrate your decision to kill someone or keep them alive, it puts more emphasis on the relational aspect of the game and on your own subjective feelings on what is or is not moral than a morality system would. Your choice isn't posed as being moral or immoral as it would be in a morality system, rather as affecting the people of the game and giving the player the experience of having someone at their mercy and what a select amount of possible consequences the choices could have. Games are experiences more than anything, and to me, aiming for a microcosm of what a real-life experience would be like is better than trying to take infinitely complex and unimaginably nuanced aspects of the human condition and attempting to recreate them wholesale in your game. Because Origins only sometimes makes a big deal about you choosing to kill or not kill a person, I think it excels at this. What about the experience before you get to that decision? While Origins offers the player many ways to play the game, the combat experiences themselves are limited. However, this is from a mechanical standpoint, that is, once the player is set in their playstyle and party composition, the game doesn't do much to make you change that up. A working strategy works indefinitely. And while most encounters are mechanically similar, that doesn't prevent the game from having standout encounters, my favorite being the Broodmother fight. The Broodmother fight is the peak of what this game has to offer and changed my whole experience with it. With more traditional action games like Souls or DMC, the emphasis is placed on the physical act of controlling your character and playing the game. Those games test your reflexes, muscle memory, pattern recognition, and dexterity. While they require strategy to be exceptionally good at, those games ultimately come down to whether you can physically execute what is required of you to beat them. Whether you can parry this sequence of attacks, dodge this move or that move, keep a combo going long enough to keep your style meter high throughout the encounter, etc. Dragon Age Origins is not like those games, but instead is a tactical RPG that you are allowed to play in real time. There's no dodge rolls, combo sequences, or parrying manually input by you. None of the things that you expect from the action games I mentioned previously. So if execution is not the highlight of the game, or what the game tests you on, that should instead be strategy, and this is what the Broodmother fight excels at and more. In the Broodmother fight, you're balancing your attention on her tentacles that move from spot to spot in the boss arena, her adds, your party's positioning, members' mana and stamina, their health, move cooldown timers, and all of these have an impact on your decision making. I came into the game not wanting to engage with the tactical elements, only wanting to play it in real time like an action game, and this fight was the first time I used the tactical pause and started repositioning my party members, looking through their moves and directly controlling someone other than my created character. If Broodmother's tentacles are up and there's adds in the arena, you have to focus on them instead of just on her, or risk being overwhelmed. If there's no adds and you've cleared her tentacles, you might want to stay to the back of the arena to force her next round of tentacles to spawn there, making space for you to attack her body without them there. If your mage is low on mana, then they can't use high damage spells or ones that buff party members or heal themselves, so they have to drink a lyrium potion. This opens them up to being attacked by mobs, requiring their fellow party members to cover for them, or they risk being killed taking a swig. Melee characters, on the other hand, don't have potions that restore stamina, and so have to build it over time in the middle of a battle. Because a character's utility tanks when they're low on stamina, and mages are especially unable to defend themselves when low on mana, properly managing your two secondary resources is imperative for keeping the party alive. AoE spells and items have friendly fire properties, so positioning your party away from their effects while keeping enemies in it is another factor to consider in combat. There's too much to possibly manage in real time, and too much for one character to handle, and that's why the tactical pause is there. In stopping time to assess the combat situation and position your party members strategically and deliberately, you're acting as their leader through the verbs of gameplay. The game really clicked for me here because of how well the mechanics of combat tell the story of your character as a leader in a way the AR system failed to, and because of my own progression of playing selfishly, only controlling my character at first, to controlling my entire party in the Broodmother fight and for the rest of the game, I felt like I had stepped up to become leader when no one else wanted to, more than the narrative of the game made me feel, making the combat the biggest narrative success for Origins. Overall, I think the combat is probably the best aspect of the game as a whole. It suffers a bit from lackluster animation here and there, and a weird feeling of predetermination, but the wide variety of play options from being a trapper, or a poisoner, or tank, or healer, and many other options, as well as how the tactical pause feature and strategy elements of the game work to make you feel like the leader of the ragtag group you gather over the course of the story, makes the combat one of the elements I appreciate most about the game. Dragon Age Origins, developed by BioWare, published by Electronic Arts, and released in 2009 for the Sony PlayStation 3, Microsoft's Windows and Xbox 360, Apple's macOS and classic macOS, is one of the most unique gaming experiences I've ever had, and one I'm not likely to forget. It was the first BioWare and the first Western RPG I've ever completed. I'm usually not huge on cutscene heavy games because I think it defeats the purpose of video games being an interactive medium and is essentially a shortcut to storytelling in games, and somewhat of a failure of game design, but this game avoids that problem by having each cutscene in the game be a form of gameplay that most of the time matters, or at the very least adds additional flavor to the role-playing aspect of the world of the game. The world of Ferelden, while oppressively dark, is very well realized, and many of its areas are masterfully designed to showcase the ethos of its people. Being a Tolkien-inspired fantasy, though, it inherits some of the shortcomings of his work, particularly its characteristic whiteness, and that hinders its ability to appeal to non-white audiences, similarly hindering their ability to be immersed in the game because of its lack of non-white characters. There are great aspects to the mechanics of the game, but they too are not without their problems. The combat is great for the variety of ways it affords the player to tackle its encounters, but the encounters themselves aren't mechanically varied enough. Its mechanics tell the story of a character as a leader very well, but the animations and hit reactions could have used some more work to be more impactful. The theme of choice and consequence is well explored by the story and during the quests, but it is undermined by the player's ability to reload their save at any time to reverse any unwanted consequence. The approval rating system is a fantastic system, allowing for dynamic interaction between the game's many party members and the player character on paper, but the system fails to result in any substantive interaction between those parties. These mechanics, with their highs and lows, give the feeling that Origins didn't quite reach its full potential, but with a solid foundation and lots to improve on, Dragon Age Origins is a first good entry in a promising series of games.